Hi everyone, welcome to this month's lecture by Dr. Sayan Dey as part of the ad hoc group 3 Food, Culture and Society of the Indian Sociological Society. So today we are honored to have Dr. Sayan Dey, who is going to speak about a very interesting topic called discardable palettes. Now, very quickly introducing our speaker today, Sayan Dey currently works as an assistant professor and department chair of English Studies at Bayan College, affiliated with Purdue University Northwest, Oman. His latest monographs are Green Academia Towards Eco-Friendly Education Systems, Routledge 2022, Performing Memories and Weaving Archives, Creolized Cultures Across the Indian Ocean, Anthem Press 2023, and Garbocracy Towards a Great Human Collapse, Peter Lang 2025. He was awarded the Nicholas Cristobal Gullion Batista Outstanding Book Award for Performing Memories and Weaving Archives in 2025 by the Caribbean Philosophical Association. His research interests are decolonial studies, environmental studies, critical race studies, culinary epistemologies, and critical diversity literacy. So today, as his title says, he's going to talk about discardable pellets and a very quick overview of what he's going to do before I let Dr. Day take over. Food tastes are not generated merely through biological and sensorial mechanisms, but are deeply entwined with socio-political ideologies and propaganda. And this is what he's going to talk about besides socio-economic impacts, how approaches related to food have generated conditions of cultural and mnemonic decapitation, as a part of which selective culinary routes associated with specific cultural and emotional practices have been systematically erased. And this talk is going to be based on his recent works like Garbocracy, which was published in 2024, and Palettes of Pleasure, co edited with Rosanna Mart in 2025. So, over to you, Dr. Day. So, we look forward to your lecture.
Thank you so much, Rituparna, for the warm welcome, for the invitation and the introduction. And thanks to all of you for joining because today it's a Friday evening, it's a weekend time. Still, you sacrificed your time for enjoyment and have joined here. And I'm looking forward to a fruitful conversation. Um, as Rituparna rightly mentioned, that it's quite an important and essential perspective, at least for me, because usually engaging with the question of discardable foods is not something new. We have been talking about the question of foods, food items, culinary practices that are historically treated as discardable, something that can be trashed, thrown out, removed um, because of their racial affiliation, cultural affiliation, religious affiliations. It can be the question of caste, class, and various other factors. Especially the question of caste becomes very relevant when we talk about discardable foods in India, right? We have been talking about Dalit foods. We have been trying to understand the fractures, the histories behind the fractures of high caste and low caste foods, the politics of vegetarianism and non-vegetarianism is obviously not very new. We know the racialization of food, especially when we look at selective food items, how they are demonized and disrespectfully projected, like food items that are very culturally rooted in the northeastern parts of India, or even within the Dalit communities as well, within the refugee communities. And I specifically will surely, as we go ahead, I'll talk about a bit because me belonging to a family whose historical roots, whose cultural roots and historical roots lie in different parts of Bangladesh, and coming from Bangladesh at different points of time, being labeled as refugees, and how our food items, many of our food items are regarded as kind of still labeled as refugee food items. And there are several other factors. We talk a lot about discardable foods, right? But I also feel that it is very much essential to talk about the question of palates, the question of taste. How do we acquire taste of certain foods? And in the eventual process of acquiring and not acquiring taste, how much it is just biological, and to what extent they are also being deeply influenced by various forms of social, cultural, religious, caste, class, and various other factors. So, my central focus of my reflections today will be on the question of taste. And that is why I have titled my presentation as Discardable Palates. Usually, when we talk about taste, the food taste that we acquire from our family, primarily from our family, obviously, and then it gradually, with time, it expands as we go around and mix around with people and communities and societies, and as we travel across, etc. And but the primary impression or the primary taste that we acquire is not just a biological process. The kind of foods that we are introduced by our family members, and I'm actually taking a very generic approach, obviously. We do have, and I agree that it is different. We come from different cultures, we come from different perspectives, we also come from different, social and financial backgrounds, and they play an important factor. But when I talk about the cultural perspective, and when we are introduced to certain tastes of food items, the usual tendencies of the families are to introduce us to traditional tastes. Now, traditional tastes that are centered on different forms of cultures. It can be the question, it can be underlined with the perspective of religion, it can be underlined with the perspective of caste, it can be underlined with the perspective of class and different other factors. And it can be just about family traditions. Now, as I said, starting from a very personal, a personal set of examples, that because I, grew up in a family, and my family belongs basically, historically, though I grew up in Kolkata and in West Bengal, um, and I grew up in a very, very multicultural space. But the thing is, when I grew up with the stories from my grandparents and my parents, and the experience that they had when they were uprooted from Bangladesh and they were forced to migrate to West Bengal, and they got settled, scattered here and there in different parts of West Bengal. One of the many challenges that they encountered was access to sufficient food, because obviously when they came to this part of the country, they have to leave majority of their belongings behind, and whatever they could bring was not obviously sufficient to settle down and start up their life in a new way. So it took a lot of time. So if we and those of us who are Bengalis, at least in here, and those who are slightly, kind of informed about the traditional Bengali cuisines, we do have a kind of big sort of fracture, which we call the Bangal and Ghoti. The Bangal culinary cultures is very much centered on what is often referred to as a refugee culinary culture, the culinary cultures, the practices, the tastes that were brought from the side of Bangladesh to West Bengal, and then obviously it gradually spread across different parts of the country with time. And Ghoti food culture, what we refer to as, is the taste, the cooking practices, the food making practices that we see of the Bengalis who were already settled in West Bengal prior to the partition, prior to the border and fractures. Now, although in today's times, we don't see a massive level of conflict, you don't really see people talking or making a lot of fuss around the whole fractions between the Bangala and Ghoti culture. But then it has sort of entered into our conversations around food in terms of acquiring taste, where even if it is in the forms of making jokes and cracking and making fun of each other in a light way, we often would be using these sort of instances, making fun of the Ghoti food culture, or the Ghotis making fun of the Bengal food culture in terms of the usage of spices, in terms of the addition of sugar, or in terms of addition of certain forms of curry, etc. Now, why I'm bringing this into our conversation, and why I started my reflections based on this particular example, is, as on the one side, we see that our food cultures, our food practices, our way of acquiring taste is much more dynamic than at least what I would say 50, 60 years back, when people were more closeted and more confined and more chauvinistic with respect to their food cultures and traditions. On the other side, we do see that even if it is in a lighter way, the normalization of the fractions of food cultures, the very normalization in which certain food items in certain culinary tastes have been permanently referred or permanently understood as discardable. Now, if I give some examples in terms of taste, like dried fish, the consumption of dried fish, again, which is very, very common across different communities in India. The consumption of dried fish and making it in a particular, preparing it in a particular way, um, is very common within the Bengal food culture, especially the people who have come from different parts of Bangladesh at one point of time. Although, again, you don't see it is really restricted within the Bengal food culture. You can see in many Bengali homes who have acquired the taste of dried fish, they do prepare dried fish and have it. But when we look at the historical roots, widely it is from the Bengal food culture. I remember that when it would be prepared at my home, usually when the dried fish is boiled, because the usual process, the way we prepare within the Bengali households, are the dried fish is first of all boiled, the water is then thrown away, and then the fish is prepared with different forms of spices. But when the boiling takes place, obviously pungent smell emanates. And I always would remember that my mother or my grandmother, whosoever will prepare it, will wake up like very early in the morning, like 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning, where almost everybody is asleep. Then they would finish the boiling part, and so that by the time people wake up, that smell, that pungent smell, is not in the neighborhood. Obviously, I don't, as an individual, I don't deny that there is a pungency in the smell, and a pungent smell is obviously not very comfortable experience. But this practice of waking up early in the morning and boiling it, and making sure that before the people wake up, the pungent smell has almost faded away, is not about just about the pungency of the smell. It's not just about the smell of the food, but also the whole labeling, that how a dried fish is a part of a disgusting food habit. And this consumption practice of having dried fish as a disgusting food habit is not just associated with the question of a food culture that was acquired by the refugees, because it's also the question about the refugees. It's a vastly a refugee food habit, at least in the context, in the socio-political context of Bengal, I would say. It is also something which is not very much acceptable within a high caste food culture as well, because again, the disgusting smell, dried fish, and even when we look at the scriptures, right? When we look at the high caste Hindu scriptures, consuming dried fish is considered as something which is deeply anti-religious, which is extremely impure. So that is why even within uh, the Brahmin scriptures, we see that where they talk about food, they in within Bengal and different parts of northern India as well, they do say that there are certain class and community of Brahmins who can consume fish, who can consume non-vegetarian food items, but they can only consume freshwater fish, because according to them, the freshwater fish is spiritually pure. But when they're having dried fish, this is not something which is pure. And then it is also about the class status as well, because the community where we are staying, the kind of people we have around, they may complain a lot about that we are having or we are cooking something which have a disgusting smell. And in the past, it has happened, like, people from the nearby places would actually complain that, okay, whatever you are cooking is becoming very troublesome for us. We cannot stay at home, or we feel very disgusted, or we feel very unhygienic when you are cooking dried fish. And this is not so. You see, when we look at this example, when we look at this one particular example, we see that the consumption or the process of preparing dried fish, or the process of consuming or not being able to consume dried fish, is not just associated with the question of food. is not just associated with the question of acquiring a particular taste. It's not just associated with the question of being able to cook or not being able to cook. But there are so many other factors. It's a question of, one's own cultural status. It's a question of one's own social status. It's a question of one's own residential status or the location where people stay, and so many other factors that actually contribute in this construction of this particular culinary item or contribute towards the taste of this particular culinary item, whether we should consume or we should not consume. Because I know that within many of my friends circle, they would actually love to have dried fish, which we will call shutki mach in Bengali. They would love to have dried fish, but they would not actually want to have it at home, or would not actually reveal it to their families that they have dried fish, because according to their family, consuming dried fish is something which shows which kind of projects a very poor financial status of a family, or the social status of a family, or the cultural status of the family, or it's kind of projected that, okay, because you don't have a good taste for fresh food, that is why you are sort of resorting to consuming dried foods. So you see, when this construction, this one particular taste, whether I want to have dried fish or I don't want to have dried fish, is not just about whether I'm liking it or not liking it. Probably even before I realize whether I would like it or not like it, it has already been preconditioned and pre-decided by the family, by the society, by the communities, by the class, by the caste, and different other tools and components who already pre-decides that whether I should acquire a taste for that food or I should not acquire a taste for that food. Now, this is where this whole narrative of discardable palettes come into existence. And this is one sort of, conflict, one sort of perspective that I always grew up with, and I still struggle, because in a lot of occasions I taste different kinds of meat or different kinds of food items which are often labeled as not fit for my religion, where do I belong, not fit for my caste to which I belong, not fit for probably my class to which I belong. And often I have been sort of projected as someone who violates the usual religious, caste, class, and various other forms of norms for the sake of consuming those foods. But, and again, today we have to understand that we currently, in the Indian socio-political scenario, in the Indian socio-political perspective, food has, I mean, along with various other factors, obviously, food has become an essential marker, and food has become an essential demarcation to create class, caste, religious, and social factors. Again, this is not something which is contemporary, which is only aggravated in the contemporary times under certain political ideologies, under certain forms of religious propaganda, but it has always been there in some forms or the other. Even when we go back to the colonial times, in the European colonial times, we see that there is a whole lot of diaries of British health practitioners, Scottish health practitioners that exist, who have actually how they have constructed this narrative that food items that are consumed in the tropical regions, food items that are consumed in the equatorial regions, how unhealthy they are, and how much it doesn't, just because it did not fit within their particular taste, just the taste of the food did not appeal to their cultural taste, to their elite taste, to their racial taste, they were immediately trashed. They were immediately labeled as discarded. But the irony is, later on, many of these food items have been hijacked, have been manipulated, distorted, and have been taken to the West, patented as an invention of the Western food, and sold back to us. So this is not a new story, even in the contemporary times as well. There is so much of, in fact, I mean, it's deeply essential to mention about the very recently published work by Shahu Patole, right? Dalit Kitchens of Marathwada. Now, when we see the different food items that Shahu Patole mentions in the book, the different kind of history behind those food items, the climate history, the cultural history, environmental history, caste history, financial history, social history. When one mentions about those backgrounds of those food items, it becomes so very much clear that how, historically, on the one side, certain food items which were, let's say, were made from discarded body parts of the animals, those body parts which were once discarded by the landowners, the zamindars, or the colonizers, they were thrown out to the people, and then people, for the sake of the survival, would gather those body parts, they would prepare something out of it, and then later on those became a part of the delicacies. Now this, when we look at this history, we see that many of these, this is why many of these food items are kind of permanently demarcated as disgusting, as something that is that is same as something that is a waste, like a garbage, that something needs to be discarded. Now, and this is another reason why in a lot of times in our homes also we would see that people are so much reluctant to have food items like chicken liver or liver of different animals, how consuming liver of different animals, of certain animals, are acceptable, while the consumption of liver of certain animals are not acceptable. Now, but at the same time, the irony is whenever these food items get packaged in a five-star restaurant or in a very posh restaurant or in a very posh place like a food festival, immediately they gain momentum, immediately they gain incentives. These are the same food items which at the local level would be sort of discarded as something disgusting, where people who are selling these food items may be subjected to harassment in the name of religion, in the name of communal purity, in the name of politics. At the same time, these are the same kind of food items that gets packaged and sold at extremely high prices in very posh locations, in very posh spaces like restaurants and food festivals. Now, why do we need to really talk about today about this whole perspective of discardable palettes? Because today we are living, and as I already briefly mentioned, and I want to continue with that, that today we are living in a time when fractions are becoming more and more celebrated than togetherness, where the values of exchange are being more and more compromised, and cancel cultures and also intolerances are becoming more and more valid and valuable than other caring and loving perspectives. And food plays a very, very essential role in the contemporary times, where we see how over the past 5 to 10 years, at least we can see that where food has played an essential role in the process of creating cultural fractions, in the process of creating social fractions, in the process of creating religious fractions, where food festivals have been bombarded by religious extremist communities in the name of religious puritanism, where often there are vast number of places in India where during certain religious festivals, certain Hindu religious festivals, the consumption of meat and the consumption of fish gets sort of banned for a month or 2 weeks or 3 months, as the calendars set by the religious communities. Then also we see where the free exchange of food items, free exchange of ideas, collective consumption practices are becoming rare with every passing moment. Now, why this is happening, and I believe more or less we are all bothered, irrespective of our political affiliations, irrespective of our positionalities, irrespective of the places that we stay, we are all bothered by these factors. Now, when we are trying to dig into the situations, when we are trying to understand the different factors, the different reasons that are causing these sort of fractions, we have to understand that it is not something that is happening today. Its root doesn't lies in the 5 years or 10 years of time. Roots lie long time back, which has remained unaddressed. And that is where, discardable palettes come into existence. Before we talk about discardable foods, this is my argument, my invitation. Prior to talking about discardable food items, prior to talking about discardable culinary cultures, or the culinary cultures that are not acceptable, that are considered as invalid. It is essential to understand how this narrative of discardability is sort of injected within our senses, how this narrative of discardability is injected within our palates. And this is why we have to look at the wider problematic roots. So when we are engaging with the question of food, or when we are engaging of what kind of food is consumable, what kind of food is not consumable, or when we are forced to conform within certain religious, through the logic of certain religious scriptures, that in which month what kind of food should be consumed and what kind of food should not be consumed, and when violence is justified, hatred is justified, erasures are justified through these particular narratives, then we have to understand that this is not again which is rooted right now, or is sort of rooted of the 5 to 10 years back. This is something that has always been existent within our culture, that has remained widely unaddressed, or may have been addressed in bits and fragments, and now only it is getting multiplied and aggravated. And this is why, again, today, as I come from the city of Calcutta, from the state of West Bengal, I can give multiple examples from that state, where you see that. And houses, when you go to rent houses, in certain spaces, it is clearly written, even if you're allowed to cook non-vegetarian items. For example, in certain localities, it's strictly written that if you are renting a house, you cannot cook non-vegetarian items. And I know this is a phenomenon which is very common across India, but because I belong to a particular city and state, I'm just citing examples from the state. And even when you are cooking non-vegetarian items, sometimes the house owners will strictly point out that these XYZ food items are not something that you can cook, because they have a disgusting smell, or the people around you won't like the smell, or they don't appreciate this kind of food. So you're not allowed to cook those food items. No, despite knowing these perspectives, these challenges which have been existent, whether it is from the question of migrant food, about refugee foods, about the racialization of foods, or even when we say the caste fractions of the foods, in spite of knowing that these problems have been existent within our community, why we have failed to address across generations is an essential question. And this is the part with which actually I would come to a conclusion of my reflections. So when we are looking at the history, a major aspect when we look at these food history and food cultures, we usually limit ourselves within the conversations about food. When we talk about a challenge about being able or not being able to consume food items, our conversations are restricted within those dynamics. We fail to see the broader spectrum. Fail to see the intersectionality of the problem. And that is from where the element, what I have also briefly talked about in the book Garbocracy, where there is a certain section dedicated to wasteful foods, or how certain food items are treated as garbage, right? And a similar kind of thing, I and Rosina Mart also, talks about, along with the other contributors, in the edited volume that is Palettes of Pleasure, which is forthcoming. That how do we classify? How are we classifying this? Usually, although a lot of works are going around food studies, which are intersecting with other cultural forms, at least in India, we can see that it is rising with time, and which is very essential as well. But most of the things that happens is, we always will focus on the spices, on the question of spices, on the question of availability of food items, on the questions of, just on the question of taste, but we hardly talk about the question of gender. We hardly talk about the question of caste. How, when we grow, or when we are being allowed to, or when we are introduced to certain food items, how that process of introduction, whether our families are introducing, whether the communities are introducing, or whether with just passage of time, we ourselves get introduced to different forms of food items, the whole process of introduction is so much rooted in the caste factors, in the communal factors, in the gender factors, in the geographical factors, and so many other kinds of factors. And these elements are essential for us to take into account, because whatever we are eating, the kind of taste that we are acquiring, the kind of categorization that we are making, whether this food has a very good taste or this food doesn't have a lot of good taste, also has to do with a lot of all the preconditioning that has been done. Not always for sure, not always for sure. I mean, we can just taste the item and we may not feel the taste is appealing to us. I'm not talking about that aspect. Let us keep that aspect aside. But on a lot of occasions, our items, the taste towards certain food items are already preconditioned. And this is why the normalization of using food as a tool to create communal fractions and cultural fractions have always been existent within our community. And the recent aggravation that we see, in the under the political garb of right-wing political ideologies, or often we talk about the Hindutva political ideologies, is just an extension of that, is just a further exploitation, is a further incentivization of the already existing challenges. So, my invitation to all of us is, especially those of us who engage with food studies, we talk about kitchen spaces, we talk about food and gender, and various other very essential factors. It is my invitation for us to also think in terms that how our palates are already preconditioned. When I am eating a certain kind of food, or when I am being said not to consume a certain kind of food or consume a certain kind of food against something, then it is essential for us to question that, is it just a question about taste? Is it just, or when somebody else is saying that this is not the taste that we would like, or when somebody would say that this is not a particular food taste that is liked by this particular community, how did this narrative emerge is an essential question for us to ask. Because if you're trying to find a solution, food is an essential signifier that unites us. And today we can see, and in the past also we have seen, that how food also serves as a factor to create fractions within us. And I think one essential way of addressing is to also kind of direct our focus towards the question of discardable palettes, that how our tastes are influenced by not just by biological factors, but various other intersectional factors like caste, class, religion, gender, color, and several other aspects. I think I'll stop here, and feel free to share your questions and perspectives. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Sayan, for that very thought-provoking talk. And we already have one question in the chat box, so I can read it out to you. It's a question from Sushmita Mishra, and she is asking if packaging plays a role in changing the status of the discardable foods. In the meantime, let me also request others, if you have questions, to put them in the chat box. And alternatively, if you want to ask them by unmuting yourself and speaking out, I request you to please keep the questions short. Would you like to respond to the first question?
Sure. Thank you so much, Shushmita, for this question. I think it's a very, very important question, especially when we are talking about discardable foods. Packaging does play an essential role, especially in a time of hyper capitalism, I would say, when a packaging of a food item, the photos, the colors on the packaging appeals to our palates more than the real taste of the food. And for instance, I usually, when we used to talk about hyperrealism in my classes, I would often give this example that as we are passing by this car, we see a big hoarding that a person is trying to eat a burger which is not even fitting within the mouth of the person, and let's say cheese and everything is drizzling by the burger, and that creates a lot of enthusiasm within us. But when we go to the shop, obviously we see that the burger is just a palm-sized burger which may not even fill our stomach. But then we really don't go to the shopkeeper and ask that, when on the hoarding you show that it is such a massive size burger that is not going to even fit within our mouth, but then we see it's a very small sized burger. We don't even ask this question, right? We would still like to have it in that form. And this is, I think, a very essential process of packaging our food, and how it is not just about packaging the food, is influencing in a way our palates as well. Because what is happening is when we are talking about the question of when we are going to a particular shop and we are seeing the packaging and we are attracted to buy that food based on the packaging, capitalism has an effect on our palate as well, because by looking at the colors, by looking at the representation of the food, by looking at the visuals, by looking at the names, by looking at the images, already there is a form of psychological preconditioning that this food item will actually taste in a specific way. And often it may end up that it is not fitting our expectations. But still, we may go back again and again to buy that food and have it because the packaging says so, the marketing says so, the demand, the public demand of the food says so. So I think this is a very important question to think, that how capitalism in the form of packaging and visual representations have a very strong impact on our palates as well.
So there are a bunch of more questions. One is about your comment on the halal certification and labeling of food. Then there is a question about how do you place food provisioning and distribution, especially within this whole process of discardability. And one more about, can there be discardable food waste too, if there are discardable pallets? And is that a mere extension of casteist conditioning in food culture? So all the questions are in the chat box in case, you want to take a look at them.
Sure, sure, sure. Absolutely. Maybe I can take one by one.
Yes.
There is this question by Shagifta. How do palettes play a role in remembering the food one have experienced in their life in diasporic culture? I think palettes play a deep down essential role. And I obviously I have not been born and brought up in a diasporic culture. I have been, but I can give you one personal example. For instance, I stayed in Johannesburg for 2.5 years for my lecturership and postdoctoral research. And one of the essential element of my postdoctoral project was about diasporic food cultures. And I remember that when I was working in Durban as a part of my field research, Durban, if we are a bit aware of the history of slavery, we know that a lot of the sugarcane plantation workers who were taken from different parts of India during the 19th century, where actually they landed in Durban, they worked in the sugarcane plantations there, and they eventually settled there. Now, in the plantations, the Indian workers were also closely working with the Zulus, right? The local Zulus. And today, if you look at the culinary culture of Durban, it's a very interesting mix of Zulu and Indian food culture. So, a go to food, ever if you go to Durban or if you have been to Durban, you must have already heard that a very common go-to food is dal and rice and carrot salad. Now, this carrot salad is a very Zulu salad preparation, and then comes the dal and rice, which was actually a very commonly served food, or commonly cooked food rather, in the sugarcane plantations, because the Zulus and the Indians, they did not know how to communicate in their respective languages. So for them, food was an essential tool for unifying them. Now, when you look at this particular taste, when you try to remember this particular taste, you just don't look into the taste. What you look here is the whole history behind the taste, the whole process of interactions behind the taste, and the historical buildup that has taken place through this exchange of tastes. So when you look at the diasporic literature as well, when they talk about food, and you're right, like, in a lot of these diaspora novels, food play an essential role. Because food play an essential role because it's also about remembering the taste of one's roots. Maybe one is not completely aware of one's roots. Maybe that particular understanding of the roots is kind of interpreted through stories heard from parents and grandparents who once were there back into their cultural roots, and then they were relocated to a different space with over time, right? But then when you listen to these stories, you also in a way start imagining that what those food items, what those tastes may mean to us. So I think in that way, food actually plays a extremely important space, extremely important role in diasporic literature and widely in diasporic culture, because it is about remembering or trying to remember the memories of the past, the memories of the ancestors, and also, in a way, whatever possible ways, it is to preserve those memories as much as possible. There is another question. Please comment on labeling of foods as red, green, and halal certification. Again, I must be very honest. Like when it comes to the question of um, when it comes to the question of halal certification of the food, it has to deeply do with the question of sustainability as well. Because although I'm not an expert in this field, so I won't be able to make a lot of detailed commenting on this perspective. But whatever little bit I understand about the halal certification, we have to understand that when we use the term halal, for many of us, it's a we often try to understand it as a category of, okay, it's about Muslim food, but it's not just about the religious association with the food, because it is also the question of sustainability. Because halal widely associates, I mean, not an exact English translation, but the concept of halal, the philosophy of halal, widely associates with the question of sustainability as well. How, let's say, halal meat, right? When we talk about halal meat, it's how the meat is cut, how the meat is cleaned, how the animal meat has been nurtured in the process of time. So we have to, and it's an essential question, because often when we look at these certifications like halal and kosher, immediately our understanding is that they are religious labelings. But a deeper historical understanding, a deeper cultural understanding would reveal that it is also the question about health, it is also the question about sustainability, it is also the question about hygiene as well. So this is the most I can talk about when we are talking about halal certification, and when we are talking about its consumption in terms of taste, consumption in terms of palates. I would say, and obviously I'm not a Muslim, so I cannot be someone commenting from within the community. I must admit that. But what is my understanding is it is not just about religious affiliation. The reason behind its consumption also has to do vastly with the question of hygiene and sustainability as well. Um, how do you place food provisioning and distribution, especially of within this whole process of discardability? Well, when we talk about, I think a lot of our ways of distributing foods, right? Especially, and I think it's an interesting question. When it comes to the time of food crisis, we often see communities coming forward and trying to distribute foods, whether it is the time of any form of natural disasters, or it can be a situation of human-made crisis as well, whatever it is. In those circumstances, it is interesting to see what kind of foods are distributed, like who are the associations who are coming forward in terms of their religious backgrounds, in terms of their community backgrounds, and also what kind of foods are distributed in the process. And it's an important question because um, in a lot of ways, again, I'm not trying to be dismissive of the purpose of the work. I do appreciate that communities come up and help each other in the time of crisis. Not always, but in a lot of times, I think it is essential to highlight that many a times the process of distributing certain kind of food items is not just about vegetarian and non-vegetarian food items, but also the different types of food items is also a representation of the purity of religion, is a representation of political propaganda and political ideologies. It is also often a representation of what kind of ideologies, what kind of food items become more consumable or become more accessible than others. Because later on a lot of times, as I said, not always, but on a lot of times, through these distribution processes, many a times what happens is these sort of instances are used as a logic to to promote propagandism through creating fractions in the consuming practices. And through that perspective, if we take this one lens, obviously this is one of the many lenses that we can take into account. If we take this one particular lens, we see that discardability does play an essential role in kind of structuring this idea about what kind of food can be distributed and where and how they need to be distributed, who should have the access, the right to access to distribute food in certain communities. These kind of questions, I think, are also very much rooted in the question of discardability and the acceptability of food. There is this question like discardable pallets. Can there be discardable food waste too? Or would that be a mere extension of casteist conditioning in food culture? I think, well, I mean, it can be both ways. When we are talking about discardable food waste, we know that even in different parts of India, which is actually quite encouraging, I would say, that Dalit communities are actually coming forward um, to organize food festivals, and which they very specifically designate as discardable food festivals, because in a way to critique, first of all, the high caste chauvinism about their food items, and the second is to have their own voice. And so discardable food waste is mostly an extension of the casteist conditioning of the food, because usually what happened, again, if we look at the whole route, or the different routes rather, because it is not about one particular route, the different routes through which the narrative of discardable palette is created, it is that which ultimately extends to our understanding of the discardable food waste, how certain food items should be discarded, how certain food items should not be discarded. Like, for instance, I'll tell you a very, very common example, and those who are born and brought up in Kolkata and other parts of West Bengal, there are situations in the local buses when we travel. There are many locations from where people will get up on the bus, with cans of fish. They might be traveling from one place to another to sell fish, and they would actually get on the public bus with fish boxes which are carrying, fish, and they will go and sell. And often the bus drivers would actually stop and allow them to get up. In front of my eyes, on a lot of many occasions, it has happened that a Muslim man has got up with a box of beef to be carried from one place to another to sell. Immediately, when the bus conductor asked the person what kind of meat you are carrying, and when he told beef, immediately the bus driver stopped and put that man out. And if you try to question them, they would say, oh, well, it has nothing to do with religion. It has to do with the smell. It has to do with that, oh, it's a public bus. So people might feel disgusted or smelly or suffocated because of the raw meat smell. But then what happens with the raw fish? It also smells, right? Then how that can be allowed in the process? So, when you look at these common examples, that how certain food items are acceptable within the public space, how certain food are not acceptable within the public space. Obviously, it's a question of caste, but then it's a question of religion, it's a question of public acceptability. And again, I think most essentially, we also have to look into this politics of preconditioning, our palates, something which we don't talk about a lot, something which we don't engage with a lot. And so I think in that way, if we look at, we will see the time threads. We have palettes, we have foodways, and then we have caste, religion, public consciousness, and so many other intertied factors. I feel next gen prefers convenience food and thereby dismiss food history or health. Yes, I do agree that. I do agree that there is always this question about ready to eat foods, and you're absolutely right. Um, and I think again, this actually has to do a lot, in a way I find quite a bit of similarity with the first question as well, with respect to the question of packaging, because again, this plays an essential role in preconditioning our approach to certain kind of food items. Again, the question of preconditioning our palates, our tastes of understanding certain food items. Um, because along with the convenience, we also start imagining the tastes of certain foods in a very fixated ways and not very much eager to understand in other diverse perspectives. So this could be actually another very essential factor to understand how our taste gets preconditioned. How has colonialism historically influenced which cuisines were elevated and which were discarded? I mean, that could be just it's a very important question. Um, it's a very essential question that you have asked, which probably can get into another new set of lecture, but I will try to be precise. See, the thing is, when we are looking at a distinction about colonial and decolonial foods, I remember um, back in 2020, probably I wrote this one article called Decolonization of Food Habits, again with Rosina, which actually was the foundation for our project Palettes of Pleasure. Decolonization of food habits and culinary practices in parts of India and South Africa. And one aspect that we are trying to argue in that work was, if at all it is possible to make a distinction standing in 2025, at least, if at all we will be able to make a distinction between what is a colonial food and what is a traditional food, especially such endless histories of spices, culinary cultures, different forms of curries, tastes, local adaptations, national adaptations that have been taking place across the world. Because a lot of vegetables that we consume today, a lot of spices that we consume today were never produced locally. They came from Latin America, they came from Southeast Asia. A lot of these came from different parts of Eastern Africa, Northern Africa, from the Gulf region, from the Middle East, and so many other forms of exchanges have taken place. But then, obviously, as you have rightly asked, we cannot really deny the influence of colonialism. We know the whole history of curries, right? How the term curry, whenever you go to any part of the world, anywhere outside India, mostly to Europe, but also in other parts of the world as well. When you look at these Indian restaurants, especially as I always joke with my friends that in anywhere you go in the part of the world, there'll be one Taj Mahal restaurant, which would be serving extremely pricey Indian foods or so-called Indian foods, catering to a very white, bland European palate. And then they are going to serve in a very decorative way with very small portions and extremely pricey foods, which even doesn't really, if at all, it is questionable deep down if they could be at all termed as Indian food in ways, right? So, this now, when we look at these food items, the way they are prepared, it's very problematic to say they are Indian because they often don't use spices, or their preparatory methods are not something that are rooted in ways we see in Indian kitchens. So there is a lot of appropriation that we have already seen in our food habits and culinary practices. So colonialism did have a massive influence, especially when we look at this established notion of authentic Indian cuisine, how this narrative of authentic Indian cuisine has been sold to the West, or let's say has been appropriated by the West, or has been hijacked by the West over time. We see that they are just a representation of certain cherry-picked food items that cater to their taste, and then they have been given a local flavor, and then they have been sold to the world as authentic Indian cuisine, which is this whole terminology of authentic Indian, for me in a lot of ways is a colonial construct. Not in every way, because we local Indians have also vastly contributed to this problem, but in a lot of ways it's a colonial construct. So when we look at the colonialism, how they've historically influenced cuisines, how certain cuisines have got elevated, how certain cuisines have got discarded, I think it is essential to look back into the whole association of the narrative of authenticity that has been associated with certain cuisines outside India and across the world. Looking at the flip side, commercialism of food has also made space into the larger culinary practices. Has this changed the way discarded food is viewed? Um, well, it is an important point that you have mentioned. We can surely say that in a lot of ways, we do have eateries, we do have local shops where a lot of food items are sold, which were once upon a time collectively, socially considered as disgusting and discarded, or even still they are considered as discarded. But then we see the acceptability um, of those food items as well. So commercialism also has, in a lot of ways, enhanced or allowed certain food items which were once upon a time regarded as disgusted or discardable as something which is normalized and can be accepted within the wider popular culinary folds. But then what vastly I have observed, when we look at the locationality of those foods, not in all cases again, I don't want to generalize, but in a lot of cases, when we look at the locationality of those food items, we see that those food items are allowed to be promoted and sold in specific locations. Those locations which may not be close to the so-called social elite residential areas, those locations which are kind of far away from the views of the social elite taste. So, we can say to a certain extent that commercialism of food has actually made into the larger culinary practices with local eateries. They are coming up. They're selling a lot of food items which were once regarded as publicly non-saleable. But then there is this underlying challenge, this underlying restriction as well, which we often tend to ignore. I think that also has to be taken vastly into consideration. As someone Bangladeshi roots and family history of displacement deeply resonated me, and the food culture and taste of Bangals, especially the use of dried fish and vegetables and fish scraps, is often seen within the realm of deprivation and the partition. However, I feel that ingenuity and the environmental factors, and absolutely, environmental factors were a major cause because, again, I'll go back to my family story. When my grandparents from my father's side, they came to Kolkata back in the 70s. At that point of time, um, they were not allowed to stay in the middle of the city. They couldn't stay in the center of the city. It was already crowded, populated, and refugees were obviously not allowed to stay there. So they have to stay in the fringes. And if you look at the environmental, the topographical structure, the fringes, they would be near to those lakes where different forms of wild plants would be growing. Today we have something called, we eat lotus flowers, we eat the stem of the lotus flowers, we eat the leaves of the lotus flowers. And there was a time, today the lotus stem, if you go to these posh restaurants, you will see that they would sold one plate of chili honey lotus stem at such high prices. But there was a time when this was regarded as a discardable food. There was a time when it would be regarded that if you're consuming lotus flowers and lotus stem or lotus leaves, it basically means that your socio-financial condition is not really up to the mark. You are not one of those elite people because you are financially struggling, so you have to depend on these kinds of plants. So, the purpose of saying this is they had accessibility only to these kind of plants and leaves through which they have to rely on. They have to be culinary, in terms of preparing innovative, they have to prepare innovative food items. And in that way, how a lot of these food items became a part of our culinary cultures. And as you said rightly, that fish scraps, because We did not have an access, our grandparents did not have an access to fresh fish in the market, or they were not even in a financial status to do so. So whatever they could gather scraps from here and there. And then there were also restrictions. If the lakes or the rivers would be belonging to some of the landowners, they would levy charges on how to have an access there, which also became quite challenging in a lot of ways. So when you look at these factors, um, we have to depend a lot on the discarded foods or the food items that were regarded as wild or wild plants, or those plants which would be sometimes just to be regarded as something to be thrown out into the waste bins. All of those things we vastly dependent on to construct our food habits and culinary practices, and also to shape our palates. So absolutely, these environmental factors did play an essential role in shaping our culinary cultures as well, and especially when we are talking about the Bengal food cults. Um, and yeah, there are restaurants, cafes where in the menu it is preferred to name a certain food item in the regional language only. So do you think language description helps us preserve our taste? I think this is a very important point that you also highlight, Rituparna. It's true that in many of these restaurants we go, though they are written in the English letters, but then they use it with, in the local lingua or the local tongue of what they're being referred to as. I think that's actually a very essential step to preserve the food items as they're named, rather than not just depending on the rash and often out of context English translation of the names, which then not just takes away the whole idea or the whole cultural perspective of the food item, but also it's in a way of or a kind of like uprooting the uprooting the cultural rootedness or the social rootedness or the historical rootedness of the food item. So yes, this is indeed an essential step to ensure that to use the regional languages or the use the regional perspectives to identify food items. But then it is also essential to understand, which often becomes impossible for many of us to understand, if just the name is used as a labeling and a marketing gimmick, or along with the name, they are trying their best to ensure the rootedness of the taste as well. Again, going back to the question of palatability of the food.
Thank you, Dr. Sayan. I think the number of questions that have been asked, and to clarify, actually, the name is mine, but the questions are not. Primarily because I think people have joined through the link that I shared, and therefore the Zoom name says it's me. But I just wanted to state that because it shows how captivating your talk has been, and so many people have asked so many questions. And I must thank you for patiently handling all of them without losing your breath, and you have actually spoken for like an hour. So thank you so much, and this was a very, very thought provoking conversation. I truly appreciate it. To all the viewers and the listeners, so the talk is recorded and it will be uploaded on the official YouTube channel of the Indian Sociological Society. And if you think that you want to contribute to the rising, or rather the emerging area known as food studies, sociology of food largely, please consider joining the ad hoc group 3, which is Food Culture and Society of the Indian Sociological Society. And Dr. Sayan, thank you once again for taking time out and doing this on a Friday evening.
No, thank you so much, Rituparna. Thank you so much, everybody. I know this is actually a topic which is an inconclusive for me. The conversations can go on, and something that has been, as I rightly mentioned at the time of my presentation, that's something that is bothering all of us in multiple ways. How often how we are getting uprooted, how we are getting displaced, how our palates are getting displaced by caste politics, cultural politics, ideological politics, and other forms of challenges. And I think this is a very essential conversation. Thank you, Rituparna, for creating this space. Thanks all of you for the conversations. I have also put my email ID in the chat box, in case you want to email me, connect me on the social media, feel free, and we can keep the conversation going. Thank you so much once again, and have a nice evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye, everyone.